Hello, my name is Adam Stolberg, and I'm Sam Nunn Professor and Chair at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs here at Georgia Tech. Welcome to today's virtual event entitled Taking Stock of the Transatlantic Relationship, ahead of several key summits, which is really right upon us today. Before we get started with today's program, I want to let everybody know that today's event is the third installment of four for this year's Sam Nunn Bank of America Policy Forum. The next event, hopefully, will take place in person towards the end of the calendar year or the beginning of 2022. The theme of this series of Nunn Forum events are reimagining or rethinking or revitalizing transatlantic relations and leadership in that relationship. And so today's event is especially apropos in that regard. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Bank of America for its generous and longstanding support. And in particular, I'd like to thank Terry Block and Ellie Perry and the recently retired Jill Toth for their enduring support in this effort. So let me begin by turning the screen over to my colleague, Professor Katja Weber. As many of you know, Katja is a pillar in our program and a real long-standing expert of EU and German foreign policy and governance. So Katja, take it away, please.
Okay, thank you. Like many of my colleagues, I have examined leadership transitions and their impact on foreign relations. So these are really interesting times for all of us. And of course, I'm delighted to be able to moderate this panel. In fact, I'm on my way to Europe on Monday to teach at Georgia Tech's campus at GT Lorraine. And I'm very much looking forward to the following next week's summits and these meetings that my colleague, Dr. Stolberg, just referred to. And of course, I look forward to discussing these events with my family and close friends in Europe. Before introducing the panel, let me just encourage the audience to please post their questions in the Q&A section rather than the chat. And then we'll try to get to as many of these questions as possible toward the end of the program. Now, I would like to introduce the panelists, brief introductions, because I know the vast majority of you are quite familiar with these distinguished people. And I'll introduce them in the agreed order of presentation. So we'll start with General Philip Breedlove. He's a distinguished professor of the practice in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. He's a highly decorated retired general of the United States Air Force, where he reached the highest levels of military leadership as SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and the commander of U.S. European Command. He's a graduate of Georgia Tech in civil engineering. Welcome, General Breedlove. Next will be Dr. Emma Ashford. She's a resident senior fellow with the new American Engagement Initiative in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. Her work focuses on questions of grand strategy, international security, and the future of U.S. foreign policy. Previously, she was a research fellow in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute. She writes a bi-weekly column, It's Debatable, for foreign policy, and she holds a PhD in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia. Last but certainly not least, my own colleague, Dr. Alasdair Young. He is professor and Neal Family Chair in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. He co-directs our Center for European and Transatlantic Studies, Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, and the Center for International Strategy, Technology, and Policy. He has written extensively on transatlantic economic relations, and he received his DPhil in European Studies from the University of Sussex in the UK. So we have agreed to discuss two broad topics. And each speaker will have roughly 5 to 10 minutes. And then we will open up for Q&A. So again, members of the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat. Okay, then we'll start with General Breedlove. The first broad topic is essentially what has changed or remained the same with this most recent change in US administration.
So, Dr. Weber, thank you very much, and good luck with your trip back to the mainland, to homeland for you. So I'll just choose sort of one topic about what has changed, and I'm sure my learned colleagues will expand into the areas of their expertise. And probably the biggest and most visible exterior change to me is that we once again see a commitment to the alliance, to NATO, and a commitment to our allies. I think he's been quoted, our president, just today in his speech as saying America is back. And I think that refocus on the importance of what NATO is and what it has done now for so many years and what it needs to do into the future is again at the forefront. I do believe that will include a refocus on collaboration with our major allies as we work through problems in the European spaces and others. I think that what we will also see is a refocus and continued focus on cohesiveness and a unified view of what the alliance needs to do and the threats that it faces. And I personally believe that cohesiveness is our center of gravity, that first and foremost, we need to focus on each other and our commitment to unity. In that commitment, we have to continue addressing our readiness and capability shortfalls. And frankly, as I have offered many times, we need to find ways to increase our EU-NATO cooperation. Many ask me, is the EU Army a threat to NATO? And I answer no every time. We are creating capabilities that deepen our bench. As long as we avoid building redundancies and wasting money on things that are already there, we'll be okay. So if this is the case, how do we manage things in a military sense as it regards to Russia, our primary concern, the Ukraine, the Baltic? And I think the refrain is very familiar. Deterrence and defense are the focus of NATO. And both deterrence and defense begin first and foremost with readiness of the forces and responsiveness of the forces. As you posed in your second question, this will impact and put new demands on our leadership. Whether you like the tactics, techniques, and procedures of the previous administration or not, one thing the previous administration was able to accomplish is a refocus on investment. And whether the 2% is appropriate or not is not the real conversation that we need to have, but we do need to have the conversations that our nations need to continue to focus on their investment. People often refer to Article 5 and common defense, but they're pretty quick to overlook Article 3, which really says defense begins at home. And nations must invest in their own ability to defend themselves and then create capabilities to add to the collective defense of others if required. I think also our leaders need to rebuild a common picture of who and what the threat is, and then focus our policies on that threat. And frankly, as I've said many times, we have to open communications with Russia. We need to begin to talk at serious levels about how to move forward rather than talking past each other. And so I'll just close with an emphasis item and say that there are things that have not changed. The kinetic threat is and remains Russia. Russia has used its military to change internationally recognized borders twice during my time as the SACEUR. when they invaded and occupied Crimea, and then when they invaded the Donbass and left behind their proxy forces. And secondarily, what also has not changed is a rising concern that maybe we'll talk about in the Q&A with China. So thank you for allowing me to give a few remarks at the beginning. I look forward to continued questions and then answering the audience as well.
Okay, thank you very much, General Breedlove. Then let me pose the same question to Dr. Ashford. What do you think has changed with the change in U.S. administration? What matters remained the same?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, and thank you so much for having me today. So I guess I'm going to try and put this in a slightly broader lens than my co-panelist, who for very obvious reasons focuses on the military aspect. And I think it's interesting that the Biden administration, just in general, has framed its foreign policy more broadly than that, right? That these relationships are about far more than just that military security aspect. You know, everything from diplomacy to trade, you know, that whole just selection of foreign policy issues. And I guess I'd also like to somewhat play devil's advocate here and argue that the changes that we see from the last administration to this administration are perhaps more superficial than you might think. Or to put it another way, despite the fact that we're about to see a series of you know, happy family photo ops, you know, with President Biden, his European counterparts, we're going to see all these summits. You know, I would argue that actually many of the policies that Donald Trump pushed during his time in office are here to stay. So when Biden says America is back, a phrase that he really likes, he actually means the whole phrase. He says, you know, he said at the Munich Security Conference, he said, America is back, the Transatlantic Alliance is back, and we're not looking backwards, we're looking forward together. And I think, you know, some of that's just rhetorical, but part of it is that America is trying to reconceptualize this relationship with Europe into the future rather than looking back at the past. The way that Biden says America is back actually means something quite different than it might have done during the Obama administration. And I'd argue that that's because there's not really a very strong appetite in Washington to build up the US commitment to Europe, particularly in the military sense, because America, on the one hand, there's a strong focus on domestic issues, and on the other hand, there's this strong focus on pivoting away to China. And I'd argue the fact that there's not really been a strong shift to Biden is indicative of the fact that Donald Trump, other than perhaps behaviorally, right, he sounded and looked very different than your average president on the transatlantic relationship. But many of the things that he did weren't actually all that distinct from previous presidents. There's a strong through line from George W. Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden on issues like trade, tariffs, willingness to start thinking about you know, European burden sharing and some pressure to do that. And so I would argue that we're actually going to see perhaps a very pronounced shift in rhetoric during this series of summits, but much more actual continuity on the policies that underlie that rhetoric. And so, you know, just to pick out a few examples, right, on trade, the Biden administration's very strong focus on this foreign policy for the middle class. Now, no one's entirely sure exactly what that means, but you could certainly interpret it to be just a sort of slightly nicer version of America First, the notion that American economic interests may not necessarily be served by free and open trade. You know, it's very bad for free traders like me, but we've seen the Biden administration maintain some of the tariffs, not just against China, but also against Europe that the Trump administration had pushed in place. And then I think on burden sharing, we are seeing, again, the Biden administration more willing than some previous administrations to push the notion that European states really do have to step up, and that however we measure that contribution to common defense, that it can't just be America all the time, in part because America has this inclination to pivot away towards China. And then finally, the final area that I would point out of continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on Europe is actually when it comes to Russia. And so obviously the Trump administration's relationship with Russia was strange, convoluted, in many ways a two-track relationship where Trump himself was very distinct from the policies of his administration. But I think the notion that the Biden administration is willing to talk to Russia, that we're having this that we're having this summit with Putin, that we're going to talk about strategic stability, I think that is somewhat of a through line from the Trump administration and represents some continuity between these administrations. So bottom line, I think pronounced shift in rhetoric, but on policy, there's actually going to be more continuity than you might think.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ashford. This is an interesting position. I'm curious to learn now from Dr. Young whether he thinks there is quite this continuity that Dr. Ashford suggested, or do you see more significant changes now from moving from the Trump administration to Biden? You're muted. Alasdair, you're muted.
Sorry, a schoolboy error. So there's, I think while I have a degree of agreement with what Emma said, I think I'd put quite a different emphasis. There is continuity, but there is really quite significant change, some of which has not been fully realized yet. But the mood music in the transatlantic relationship is now completely different. Right? So gone is talk of the European Union as a foe. We now have concerted efforts to address prominent irritants. Right? But the relationship hasn't snapped back to where it was at the end of 2015, and it's not going to. Right? So I agree with Emma on that. And before I discuss the state of play, I think it's important to have some context. The transatlantic relationship, or the economic relationship, is the most complex in the world for two reasons. One, it is more an investment relationship than a trading one. Foreign affiliate sales, that is sales by European companies in America and American companies in Europe, are almost 4 times the volume of total trade. It is estimated that half of all trade occurs within firms, that is, between the entities of the same firm on the opposite side of the Atlantic. Now, this commercial relationship has been affected only at the margins by the policy disputes that we've seen during the Trump administration and in past administrations. But given the value of the relationship, those costs have been non-trivial. The second reason is that the management of the bilateral relationship does not occur only between the two parties. It has an important multilateral dimension. The US and the European Union are the primary architects of the World Trade Organization. And even though transatlantic cooperation is no longer sufficient to advance the multilateral trade agenda, it remains necessary. And the World Trade Organization has played a vital role in managing transatlantic disputes in the past. The transatlantic relationship has also acquired a trilateral dimension, how the US and the EU can cooperate in responding to an economic challenge posed by China. This emerged in the Obama administration in the form of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations. It faded under President Trump, but never entirely disappeared, but it now appears to be a critical focus of the Biden administration. One Commission trade official recently estimated that the United States and the EU agree on about 80% of issues, although it's the other 20% that attract all of the attention. Now, I would actually say that both sides have made a concerted effort to ease the tensions in the bilateral trading relationship, but not all will be easy to resolve. Both sides have suspended WTO authorized enforcement tariffs in their long-running dispute over subsidies to Airbus and Boeing, while they seek to negotiate a settlement by mid-July, and those talks are reportedly going well. Now, the Biden administration has not lifted the tariffs imposed on steel and aluminum imports from the EU and other places, imposed on the Trump administration on national security grounds, but the EU suspended the doubling of tariffs that had been scheduled to occur on the 1st of June, while the two sides work on how to overcome the underlying problem of excess capacity in the industry. And the US has dropped any talk of imposing similar tariffs on automobile imports, which was always the bigger concern for the EU. The US's proposals on corporate taxation in the context of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which were endorsed in principle by the G7 finance ministers last week, provides a path for resolving the tensions caused by a number of EU member states adopting digital service taxes. Now, the United States Trade Representative last week said that tariffs should be imposed on those countries because those taxes discriminate against US firms, but also said the tariffs should be suspended for 180 days as the OECD talks progress. The European countries are unwilling to lift their digital service taxes until the international agreement is concluded and implemented, while the US wants them suspended as part of the negotiation. Finding a solution will be further complicated because the European states are divided amongst themselves between those that are higher and lower tax countries. While there have been concerted efforts to address some of the outstanding bilateral tensions, there are several looming issues which could create new friction. The Europeans are concerned that the US will implement more stringently the Buy American provisions in the COVID-19 relief bill and or the infrastructure bill, that is, not to treat signatories of the government procurement agreement, including the EU, as they do US firms, or even treating the US operations of European firms as foreign. US companies, on their part, are very concerned about the implications of the EU's wide-ranging agenda on governing the digital economy, particularly with respect to the Digital Market Act, which concentrates on dealing with competition issues, the regulation of artificial intelligence, and potential pressures for data localization. In addition, the European Commission is due to propose a carbon border adjustment mechanism this summer, which could well be a source of tension despite the Biden administration setting similar carbon reduction targets to those of the EU, because the US's approach is heavily reliant on technological gain rather than the pricing of carbon. There has also been some improvement in the relationship at the multilateral level, but it's more limited than in the bilateral relationship. Notably, the US has accepted Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as Director General of the World Trade Organization, but the US has not stopped blocking the appointment of judges to the World Trade Organization's appellate body, which would enable the organization's dispute settlement function to resume. The Biden administration has been more constructive in talks about how to address the US's outstanding reservations about how the process operates, but the US wants the US to stop blocking judges before the issues are resolved, while the US wants reform first. As I suggested earlier, there's been a renewed attention to cooperation with respect to China, but it's in its early days and there are conflicting signals. The conflicting signals are due in large part to differences amongst EU member states about how to engage with China. Nonetheless, the European view of China was becoming more skeptical before the pandemic and has hardened since. The conclusion of a political deal on a comprehensive investment agreement between the EU and China in December seemed to reflect continuing commitment to engagement and a disconnect between strategic considerations and economic interests, including neglect for the preferences of the incoming Biden administration. That administration's future, however, is now very much in doubt due to Chinese actions. In addition, the EU has been developing a number of unilateral measures aimed at addressing Chinese economic influence in the EU, to have enhanced screening of investment on security grounds, the developing instruments for addressing the impacts of foreign subsidies in the single market. And in March, the EU joined the US, Canada, and the UK in imposing sanctions on the Chinese government over human rights abuses, particularly against the Uyghur minority. This is a big deal because these are the first sanctions that the EU has adopted against China since those imposed in response to Tiananmen in 1989. Those abuses and China's retaliation to the EU sanction have crippled the comprehensive agreement on investment in Europe. While the EU shares many of the US's concerns about China's behavior, Europeans are not entirely comfortable with the Biden administration's framing the conflict in terms of democracies versus autocracies, which they see as too conflictual. Now, that said, in December, the EU proposed creating a Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. This is a high-level forum for the two sides to discuss issues such as regulatory approaches, cybersecurity, emerging technologies, and standard setting. And it is presented as a way of responding to China's effort to set technological standards. The U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai has said that the U.S. is very interested in the proposal, but after 5 months, there was no official response. And it's worth noting in this context that an enduring feature of the transatlantic relationship since the new transatlantic agenda in the mid-90s is that the EU is far more keen than the U.S. in formal structures of cooperation, while the U.S. prioritizes outcomes over process. Despite those reservations, given the opposition to the creation of such a body in the U.S. and its symbolic value, the creation of the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council seems a likely outcome from next week's summit. The transatlantic economic relationship, therefore, has significantly improved over the past 5 months. The U.S. has pivoted from seeing the EU as part of the problem as to being part of the solution. The Europeans have shifted from damage control to trying to make progress. Transatlantic tensions have not disappeared, but they are more about means than ends, and those tensions are also bounded by the guardrails imposed by both parties valuing the relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there is a fair amount of disagreement here, at least with respect to some of the finer points, but not surprising either because you really address different issues. Dr. Young looking more at trade, Dr. Ashford as well, of course, General Breedlove more concerned in his remarks about NATO. Let me pose the second question and encourage you to interpret it as broadly as you would like. So basically, we're trying to get at what are the implications for leadership within and also by the transatlantic partnership. And feel free to talk about Russia and China and interpret it broadly. So back to General Breedlove on this one.
Great, thanks. And I actually believe the panel was well balanced. We had great sort of geopolitical remarks from Dr. Ashford. We had economic remarks from Dr. Young, and then we had the Cro-Magnon military remarks from me. So I will stay in my lane. And what I'd really like to do is to focus on conversations that I've had with military leaders, since you're asking about leaders, as I have helped some and helped shape message for some. And it might surprise you some of the things they are thinking about. First is improved global integration. As we look at threats that go beyond Russia and the growing concern about China, improving global integration is important. And as I took over the command in 2013, one of the first things that came to my plate was that we had 9 nations sailing in the RIMPAC exercise. For those in the audience who don't know what RIMPAC is, it is one of the largest exercises in the Asia-Pacific region all year long. And so we had 9 NATO nations that were concerned enough about the free flow of goods and trade that they were participating in this exercise back in 2013. And so what I would say is that concern about how things are happening in the Pacific region has only grown over time, and that the military leadership of NATO is looking outward to understand how they can better cooperate, understand, exercise, build capacity with these global players that are formerly seen as well outside of NATO's remit. Some things that the leaders are talking about are just bread and butter, and I've mentioned them already, but it needs to be resaid, and that is that there'll be a relentless focus on NATO readiness and NATO resilience. The resilience really points to the last two things that the leaders are really working on now. And that is resilience not to the kinetic problems that NATO and NATO military leaders are facing, but resilience to the below the line or gray zone or hybrid problems that NATO nations are facing. And this is, as we have seen so much in the recent days, everything from ransomware to malware, from disinformation to attacking democratic values. These are all the things that NATO is focusing on because we're not well organized around those subjects and issues which lie below the lines of kinetic response. A very keen desire is to advance NATO's cyber defense. I must tell you, in talking with these leaders, I dislike that term, NATO's cyber defense. I think we need to be focused on NATO's cyber warfare capabilities, which include offensive capabilities. I liken this, when I talk to the leaders, with a world-class tennis player that goes into the French Open and he agrees to receive serve for the entire match and never tries to hit an offensive shot, just returns the volley. We would never do that. And no military person would ever do that. And I believe that we are limited primarily in the policy sphere in NATO on how that we can and do respond in cyber. And the basic question I ask the leaders are, until we increase the cost on Mr. Putin in this below-the-lines war, why would he change? He's having magnificent successes in these spheres now, and the cost is really not changing to him. And then finally, it should come as no surprise that NATO is beginning to look to its activity in space, better organized in space, trying to understand how nations that act very sovereignly in space begin to act in the way of allies and alliances. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. I see we're getting questions from the audience. So let me encourage you again to please post those in the Q&A, and I hand it over to Dr. Ashford.
Great, thanks. So, I guess let me just continue trying to be a little provocative and hope my fellow panelists push back on me. So you asked the question sort of what are the implications of Biden, the Biden administration and all these summits for leadership within and by the Transatlantic Partnership? And again, I would say, insofar as leadership is a buzzword, a feel-good term, sure, America's back. But this has some other implications, right? So first, we're back to all the classic problems in the transatlantic relationship. All of the issues about burden sharing, the issues about how to deal with in Europe, and all of these classic problems are confounded, I would argue, by sort of a couple of other key problems. So first, unlike the last time we had these conversations in sort of the Obama administration, is the US redefining its global role, particularly with regard to the Asia Pacific, particularly with regard to China, and that puts a very different complexion on some of these discussions that were effectively buried at the end of the Obama administration when the pivot to Asia just sort of petered out in favor of some of this renewed focus on Eastern Europe and on Russia. And then the second factor that really confounds this, I would say, is an American domestic political question, and that's whether Donald Trump will return in 4 years, because we're seeing a very pronounced wariness among European leaders about whether Joe Biden has the capacity to say or commit to the notion that America is back in the transatlantic relationship, or whether we are merely 4 years or 8 years away from a return of Trump or something like him. And I should say that even if you don't believe that Donald Trump himself will come back to the presidency, for those who watch sort of the shifts shifts in US foreign policy and those debates domestically, I'd argue that there's been a much broader shift in Republican foreign policy towards a more Trumpian, unilateral, nationalistic line, and leaders in European capitals are watching that pretty closely. So that is a big new problem, in addition to all the old problems that we're sort of rediscovering. So another kind of big interesting development, though, when it comes to leadership is, I would argue that partly as a result of Donald Trump, voices in Europe are becoming increasingly important within this relationship. We used to have this transatlantic relationship where America was the undisputed leader. America took the key role in military and often in political issues. And I would argue that what we're seeing is the start of a very slow shift, a transformation in that relationship to a slightly more balanced one, where we move from America being sort of the first mover on every issue to a situation where we actually do see more of a dialogue on quite a few issues. And so those are kind of the new developments, but then we do have these classic problems. And I think, in the context of these new developments, we have to consider all the old classic problems. Who is talking on behalf of Europe, right? So in Washington, it's very easy to just say, oh, the US should cooperate more with Europe, right? But what does that mean, right? Are we talking about dealing with NATO through the security angle? Are we talking about the European Union? Are we talking about whether the European Union should have more of a security role? And there's pressure, some pressure out of Germany, particular pressure coming out of France on that notion of building up a homegrown EU defense, which the US was always much more opposed to. The Biden administration seems a little more open to. The role of the UK post-Brexit is another big shift. The US used to typically view the UK as, in some ways, it's inside man, inside the European Union. Whether that was true or not, that is no longer the case. And the UK is in a position where it wants to be very useful and important to the US, but has largely wrecked or is trying to rebuild those ties with continental Europe. And then there's the question of bilateral relations and differences within the European bloc, right? So consider the problem of Russia. Different states within the European Union, as sort of emphasized by the Nord Stream 2 dispute recently, different states within the European Union, within NATO, feel very differently about how they should approach the problem of Russia. And so none of these are new problems, none of these are new observations, but they do complicate some of those shifts that we're starting to see in this relationship. And then I guess a final point that I would make is, if we're going to talk about leadership, we really need to ask, leadership for what? On what issues? And this is where I think we start to get into the really interesting conversation about sort of new international structures. So there's been some movement to start talking about some kind of coordinating organization of democracies. A couple of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council just put out a paper arguing that the G7 should get transformed into a D10. This is an initiative that's quite popular with the British government. And just to massively oversimplify this question, the US wants to talk about new structures that focus on China and focus, as I think it was Alasdair said earlier, on this democracy versus autocracy question. Europe is far less keen. Most European capitals, even with sanctions on China related to the Uyghurs, even with the issues with the comprehensive agreement on investment, they're far less keen to pivot to this democracy versus autocracy approach to the world. So I think there's just a lot of disagreement between the US and various European states on what issues they should be focusing on, which issues are actually important, and where our priorities should be going forward. So, I think there's some really big issues that the Biden administration is going to have to handle going forward. And I guess let me end on just one optimistic point, which is that I actually view this as still a far healthier relationship between the world's two biggest advanced industrialized blocs than it was before Donald Trump, because I think the transatlantic relationship is slowly starting to become more, if not an alliance of equals, then at least a conversation between countries that can contribute in different ways. And it's not just all the US all the time. And I think that's a much healthier place to be. And so I hope we continue to make progress on that front, even as we deal with some of these problems.
Thank you very much. An alliance of equals, I like that. However, we only see that with respect to some issue areas and not others. If I think about Afghanistan, for instance, right, the Europeans felt extremely blindsided by the US withdrawal there. So we make progress with respect to some issue areas, but we still have a ways to go. But nevertheless, I appreciate the optimism. Back to my colleague, Dr. Young.
Thank you. And in this, I agree perhaps more with Emma than it seemed in the first time around, but I also have elements of agreement with Katja. So the leadership in the transatlantic economic relationship has not, and it will not return to the pre-Trump version. The Europeans are concerned that Trump's America First trade policy was not an aberration. As Emma mentioned earlier, there's a question about how different trade policy for the middle class is from America First. And there are also echoes of the America First, of this in Biden's emphasis on Buy American and the continued consideration of using trade policy on national security grounds. Europeans are also worried, as Emma mentioned, that another or the next president might embrace a hostile stance towards the EU. Further, the ease with which President Trump was able to reverse important Obama policies, such as the Paris Accord and the Iran nuclear deal, make the Europeans skeptical about the US president's ability to deliver. And we see this in the Europeans wanting US commitments enshrined in law and wanting the US to move first on a number of issues. And because of the desire to see things framed in law, there are now concerns about what a potential Republican gains in the midterms might mean for the Biden administration's ability to deliver on any sorts of agreement. And so, as a result, as Emma alluded to, the EU has become a less willing follower. And this is signaled rhetorically in trade policy and calls for greater open strategic autonomy. It's more concretely suggested by the Europeans' pushback against the Biden administration's proposal for a waiver from WTO patent protections for COVID-19 vaccines, wanting the US to implement any OECD tax agreement before they lift their digital service taxes, European countries not following US bans on investment in Chinese companies linked to the military or selling surveillance technologies. Right? So these are indications that there's a greater reticence on behalf of the EU, but this is not fully appreciated in Washington. And so there seems to be an assumption that the EU will follow. And Katja alluded to the decision to pull out of Afghanistan. The Europeans were really resentful that the US did not warn, let alone consult them about throwing its support behind the vaccine patent waiver at the WTO. So that's why there's considerable goodwill on both sides of the Atlantic and considerable agreement on ends, if not always means. The US and or priorities, the US and the EU are going to have to learn anew how to work together. And this would suggest, as Emma was alluding to, that the US should more actively consult the Europeans before launching new initiatives on which it wants European support. It needs to treat the EU as more equal, if not unequal. But doing so at times will be complicated by enduring differences amongst EU member states on important issues, not least how to engage with China. It's come up several times. If the EU's member states are unable to agree amongst themselves, consulting with them will be much harder. And the Biden administration will also have to recognize where US and EU interests, including on China, and perhaps focus more cooperative efforts on where those issues align. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we look at questions from the audience, I just want to ask the panelists whether there's anything else that they wish they had said, maybe something that was triggered by the remarks of the co-panelists. Anything you want to add before we go to the Q&A? Anyone?
I just wanted to echo that point, that both Katja and Alasdair said about, that Europe still feels left out of many decisions. I do think that there is increasing willingness in Washington to sort of consult more with European capitals, to think of them more as important partners rather than just they follow. But I think that shift has only gone so far as of yet. And I think you are right that on the decision with Afghanistan, on the decision to do with patent waivers related to COVID vaccines, there was some strong pushback from various European states as they felt that they basically hadn't been consulted at all. So I think that shift in Washington is only going so far, at least thus far.
Okay, thank you. Then I shall read the first question. It's not sent to anybody in particular, so anybody who would like to answer. What are the long-term implications of leaving open skies treaties? Does President Biden, meeting publicly with Putin so soon after several events, maybe hacking, the Belarus hijacking, the Navalny, give him unnecessary legitimacy on the global stage?
I'll offer an opening remark. I am personally less concerned about the Open Skies Treaty, but I am concerned about the trend of treaties failing. And for me, and I think for Senator Nunn and others, the intermediate nuclear forces agreements and things, these are to me very impactful, and we need to find a way back to constructive arms control, nuclear arms control, and most concerning for a commander in the field like I was, of course, are these intermediate forces capabilities that were a part of the discussion that led to the demise of the INF. Of course, the West believes that Russia had abrogated the treaty 6, 7, 8 years ago as they introduced these new capabilities in Europe, and then very publicly the U.S. then exited a treaty which it was probably the only member in the treaty at the time, and all of this is bad press, and it's also bad behavior, I think, on a grand scale. We need to find our way back to arms control in a legitimate, verifiable way.
Okay. Thank you. The next question goes to you, General, as well. The IISS study just recently assumes that Europe must defend itself as the US focuses on China. Is that at all feasible?
I don't agree with those conclusions. I think the thrust of the study brings up some very pertinent points which are legitimate, and that is the United States is shifting some focus to China, and that is going to have to be compensated by, I think, in European capitals. But there are magnificent things that the European militaries bring to the alliance. But there are some capabilities which are complete shortfalls outside of the United States. Real capability for strategic lift, real capability for strategic air refueling. Some of the more impactful ISR, or as the Europeans call it, ISTAR capabilities. These things that a long time ago we labeled low density, high demand, meaning there were very few of them and there was lots of demand for them. The United States brings the vast preponderance of those forces to the ability to defend in Europe. And so, yes, there is going to be some things that are shortfalled because of splitting between two large problems, but the idea of Europe having to go it alone, I don't think is is a real player. That's just my opinion, Dr. Weber.
Okay, thank you. Do any of the co-panelists want to weigh in on this?
Sure, yeah. Just on the question of, can Europe defend itself? Just moving past the question of whether they should or not, and I think here I would disagree with General Breedlove, and I would argue that Europe probably does have to learn to or move towards the ability to defend itself more, because the US can no longer continue to carry that burden. But I would just point the questioner to a really great article by Barry Posen, published in, I think it was Survival a couple of years back, in which he actually does a full defense analysis of could Europe defend itself in the absence of US forces, and concludes that it would be possible. So I'll drop a link to that in the chat. It's a really good study. And then on the first question about, does Biden meeting with Putin give him unnecessary legitimacy on the global stage? I agree with General Breedlove that we need to get back to talking to the Russians about issues like strategic stability. And I think there's been this very unhealthy move in US foreign policy over the last decade or so towards the notion that you shouldn't talk to certain states, that certain leaders are so odious that we can't actually talk to them. But if we go back even just a couple of decades further into the Cold War, we spoke with Soviet leaders all the time. We understood that we had sort of interests in maintaining strategic stability, making sure that we didn't destroy one another with a global war with nuclear weapons. And I think the US is very much just out of the habit of negotiating with adversary states like Russia and China. I don't think anybody expects that the summit with Putin is going to yield dramatic progress, is going to yield a reset with Russia. But there is a whole subset of areas that we can talk about that are sort of confidence building measures that help us try and move back in the direction of arms control, and of at least building the connections back to Russia that we need to prevent things from getting worse. And so, I would argue that in that context, saying that meeting with Putin gives them legitimacy is just the wrong frame in which to consider this.
Okay, interesting perspective. I think I also want to just weigh in briefly on the European defense question. I mean, not too long ago, we heard repeatedly that the US was doing the cooking and the Europeans the dishes, and that there was this clear division of labor. The Europeans, again, deal with the Petersburg tasks, the humanitarian intervention, crisis prevention, those kinds of things. The Americans do the hard fighting. It seems to me that those days are clearly over. There has to be more that the Europeans will do for their own defense, but certainly that would never sever the ties with the US. I mean, the Europeans have zero interest in this. So I also think that IISS study is a little bit over the top with that regard. Moving on to the next question. Nubar Afayan of Moderna and Ian Premer are pushing for more US leadership on the pandemic. Americans likely lose interest quickly, and momentum to make long-term impacts on global health policy is fading. Is this an opportunity to restore US legitimacy? How best can Biden leverage the transatlantic relationship? Alasdair.
I can take a stab at this. I mean, it's. I suppose there's a question on the U.S. side about. I mean, we have the U.S. move to support the waiver for from patents for COVID-19 vaccines, seen as and very much seen by the Europeans as a move for the U.S. trying to steal the high ground and claim legitimacy, and that was one of the things that profoundly annoyed the Europeans, that they actually got, outmaneuvered on that, and the view that, the patents aren't really the problem in terms of vaccine production. I mean, we've seen the move today with the Biden administration acquiring 500 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine to be distributed to the rest of the world. And we're seeing increasing rhetoric in the U.S. now about that fixing this problem is going to mean addressing, even in the U.S., is going to mean addressing the global spread of the pandemic. So there's sort of a rhetorical commitment to doing more globally. I think there's going to be the vaccine hesitancy in the US is actually going to be an impediment here, because if the US had clearly achieved herd immunity, it would be an easier political sell to say, okay, now we can really help the rest of the world, and it will be to our advantage. As long as you have a large proportion of the US population unvaccinated, the sort of the sense of saying, well, we should make sure we've got our own potential reservoirs of the virus domestically. So why do we need, worrying about those ones abroad might be harder to deal with. But I think as the situation in both the US and the EU improve, I think both will be looking to beyond their borders. And this is an area where cooperation is so obviously beneficial. So I can see them finally getting past, the argument about the vaccine waiver to focus on more concrete issues down the road. But I don't think I think it'll be much more of a joint exercise than sort of just the US with the Europeans in the buggy car.
Just to add to that, oh, sorry, Katja. I was just going to say, to add to that, my my initiative at the Atlantic Council has been doing some work on this issue. We had a big sort of meeting to discuss it with a number of participants in DC a few weeks back, and I just thought the conclusions of that group might actually be worth sharing here, because there was one conclusion was that actually from the point of view of pushing vaccine diplomacy, pushing the effort to vaccinate the world, the frame of great power competition that's so popular in Washington these days is actually fairly useful as long as it doesn't go too far. And so the participants basically sort of ended up circling around this idea of the Biden administration can probably build domestic support for vaccine diplomacy by using that great power competition frame, but they don't want to push it too excessively abroad, lest countries start to sort of see whether they can accept the vaccines or not as a political issue. And I just thought that ended up being a very interesting takeaway from those discussions we had with experts.
Thank you. The next question. Press leaks indicate that Biden will sign an administrative arrangement at the summit that will allow the US to join the EDA in certain multilateral R&D projects. Biden is also emphasizing a Buy America policy for all defense procurement. Can these two positions be reconciled? To anyone who would like to go first?
I can take a stab at it. And I think these things are actually very easy to reconcile. And the only people who would be paying any attention at all would be members of Congress. And the thing is that Buy American never means just buying from Americans. And then you have things like the government procurement agreement, where the US recognizes that American companies benefit from government contracts abroad, and so it allows reciprocal access, right? And the European member states are part of that. In defense spending, the US, already spends money, buys equipment from Europe, from non-US manufacturers. So particularly if it's linked to the idea that the US, by joining the EDA, is creating new opportunities for American defense contractors in Europe, I don't see any problem in making, doing anything to undermine the reciprocity at home being a problem.
Okay, do the others have any thoughts on this or? Nope. Okay, then we'll move on to the next question. Does a more stable relationship with Russia require the recognition, or at least implicitly, of a Russian sphere of influence in the former Soviet space, the Baltic states excluded?
not my area of expertise, but I'll put the first oar in the water, and then I'll allow the two professors to grade my paper. Every time I'm asked about this sphere of influence question, I like to turn the question in a different way. And that is that I believe one of the Western values that is a huge part of the NATO alliance is that nations, sovereign nations, have the sovereign right to choose their path in the world, be it east, west, north, or south, and with whom they affiliate. And that no other nation owns a veto on those actions. And so I rather than talk about spheres of influence to allow conversation, I reiterate, as Dr. Ashford picked up, that conversation, real conversation, is important, and we need to move forward on that. But real conversation doesn't mean that we have to negate the sovereign rights of nations. And so I think those two have to be reconciled.
Well, yeah. So I do not believe that we should be, formally or even implicitly telling Russia that they can have a sphere of influence. I would note on the question of sovereignty of the countries in the post-Soviet space. Countries have the right to affiliate with whoever they want. The defense alliances in countries also have the right to decide who they will defend. And I think that putting it in terms of spheres of influence is perhaps misleading. I think it would not necessarily be a bad idea to consider at least an implicit assertion to the Russians that NATO is not going to expand further to Ukraine and Georgia, to put a cap on the sort of issues that have surrounded that question since the Bush administration first announced in the mid-2000s that it wanted to offer Ukraine and Georgia a membership action plan. The notion that NATO might expand into those countries has been one of the root causes of the conflict and uncertainty that we've seen in that space over the last decade. And I think even if we are not willing to talk about permanently closing NATO's open door, then at least acknowledging the reality that membership for Ukraine and Georgia is probably just never going to happen in practice, I think could actually go some way to improving relations with Russia and perhaps to stabilizing the conflicts in those areas, particularly in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Dr. Young. What is the US's role in the current Northern Irish disputes, if any? It was rather effective in diplomatic efforts in the 1990s. Could a trade deal and other diplomatic efforts ameliorate some of the pains of Brexit?
All right, so there are almost two questions there. The issue at the moment, it requires a lot of unbundling. So the agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom on the UK's departure said that there could be no physical border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And that has de facto meant that there has to be a border for goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And the focus of the United States and the focus of the Northern Ireland Protocol was on preserving the Good Friday Agreement, which is the peace settlement between the Unionists and Nationalists in Northern Ireland that was brokered by the UK and Irish governments. And so that focus was very much on the Northern Ireland border, about trying to prevent the resurgence of nationalist opposition to continued membership in the UK. What has happened is, and the U.S.'s position is still focused on that, and all indications are Biden is going to, and so complicating myself, right? One of the problems has been that by introducing a border between the UK and Northern Ireland, creating frictions, that has led to a rise in tensions and some protests by unionists in Northern Ireland. So the other side of the peace process has been destabilized by the border that's had to be created. And the British government, in an attempt to ameliorate those tensions, has taken a very light touch to enforcing what it agreed to do as part of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the EU is getting increasingly upset about this, and it's about to become a much bigger issue because shortly the export of sausages from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, which is a pivotal issue, is likely to get constrained if the UK continue to enforce the Northern Ireland Protocol as intended. And so you have these two competing tensions, which are actually, so preserving free trade between Northern Ireland and Ireland is about reassuring nationalists. Preserving free trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland is about reassuring unionists. And so by privileging one border over the other, it's created tensions as well. So there needs to be some way found to resolve that. The United States, I don't think, can really do much in this other than emphasizing that it is really important to resolve that issue peacefully and constructively. And there's all sorts of there were ways to do it. It's not going to be as easy as Boris Johnson claims. Of course, he's claimed everything is easy, and he's been wrong consistently. So I think his track record is unlikely to be undermined in this case. But I don't see that there's anything the United States can do externally. There's no agreement that the United States can negotiate with the UK that would address this problem at all, let alone address the negative economic effects of the UK leaving the EU.
Okay. Other thoughts on the Northern Irish dispute? Alasdair did a pretty comprehensive job of looking at this. So, well, then maybe allow me to also ask a question. Of course, we've been discussing the transatlantic relationship and looking at the run-up to the NATO Summit, US-EU relations, the G7 coming up. We've talked about US-Russia. Of course, that covers sort of one half of the world. And it seems that in addition to the transatlantic relationship, maybe we could speculate about whether there'll be continuities or changes in the US-Asia-Pacific relationship. So I wonder whether any of the panelists are willing to speculate on that. You've invoked China repeatedly during our conversation. So do you think we'll see more continuity or significant change there?
Well, I guess let me just, since I brought it up in my opening remarks, let me just say, I think there has been substantial continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on the question of China. There's been a really strong effort, I think, by the Biden administration, by people close to them, to portray this as something different than it was in the Trump administration, but in practice it looks very similar. And by that I mean that the Biden administration has been quite keen to promote the democracy versus autocracy angle here. That this isn't just great power competition. So the Trump administration very much conceptualized this as kind of a very unilateralist, nationalist, great power competition, where the problem was China's rise. In a power sense, in an economic sense, there were trade problems, but it was less about political systems and governance systems. And I think what we've seen in the Biden administration is an attempt to sort of put this in a framework that is as much about, competing systems of governance. And I think from what I can tell, there's still even some debate inside the administration on whether that is the right framing to pursue here. But that really is very much a rhetorical difference. It may shape some of the choices the Biden team makes down the road on sort of where to focus their attention in terms of alliances and partnerships. But right now it is really mostly a rhetorical difference, and there's just a lot of continuity there on the China question. But I'm curious to hear what the other panelists think on this question.
Thank you. Alasdair, or?
Well, I also talked about China, so I'll weigh in. I think I largely agree with Emma. There is certainly much more continuity than change. I think the two places where you see a difference is one, as Emma alluded to, the shift from framing it as U.S. versus China to democracies versus autocracies is an explicit attempt to enlist allies in responding to China. And I was talking about it in the context of the EU, but it's also, Biden's been working with Japan and Korea and increasing, getting more explicit support for Taiwan. And then the other, so there's a more collaborative response to China. And then the other is about trying, it's not just about trying to keep China at bay, but by sort of, with a stiff arm, but by running faster. We see that in the bill passed by the Senate yesterday about investing in U.S. innovation. And so, the way to respond to China is not just to try and stop China, but to do better ourselves. And I think that's a much more explicit piece of the Biden administration's response. But the concerns haven't changed. To an extent, the objectives haven't changed, but the modalities, I think, have become broader.
Okay, thank you. Bill, any thoughts or?
My thoughts are tangential, so I'll be extremely brief. When I spoke in the very first question, I talked about as we look at the post-Trump changes that we were talking about, one of the things I said is we need to refocus on what we believe the threat is. And do we see China as a threat amongst us and our allies in Europe, or do we see it as an opportunity or a combination thereof? I believe it's the latter. And understanding that cooperation or opportunity piece brings tentacles that we have to understand in the threat regime, and then developing policies to deal with that, I think, are really important. One of the things that was most divisive in NATO when we first saw Russia invading Crimea and then Russian forces in the Donbass is that we didn't see the threat the same way in Europe, because several large European countries were doing huge business with Russia. And so they categorized the threat very differently, which delayed our response and changed our response, and in the end limited our response, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we have the same problem as it relates to China. I believe we should look at working with China as an opportunity, but we need to understand, therefore, what it may cost us, and we need to understand that collectively and build policy around that collectively.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think there are interesting parallels there with respect to the burden sharing argument that we see between the Europeans and the Americans. Obviously, that's a topic in Asia Pacific as well. And you, General Breedlove, talked about the importance of Article 3 defense beginning at home. I think this could be increasingly a position that the US also uses toward the Asia Pacific, expecting the Japanese, the Indian government, the Koreans, the Australians to do more. We have another question, so I will move to that. Going forward, what balance should the US strike between relations with European national governments and the EU as an entity? Should US-Europe relations continue to channel mainly through national capitals or more through the EU, as Max Bergman of the CAP and others have argued? Anybody who would like to respond?
Let me jump on that in, again, staying in my lane. And I will liken this question to the thing we talked a little bit about before, whereby some people see the EU and an EU army as a threat to NATO. I think that we need to embrace the EU. The more NATO works with the EU and the more the US works with the EU, the better we all will be. And as long as the EU, of which the vast preponderance of their nations are also NATO nations, or not the vast preponderance, but a large number of their nations are also NATO nations, to the degree that EU is enhanced and we are more cooperating with them, it only benefits us and our NATO allies. So I understand the question, but it's not something I'm concerned about. I believe we need to deal with nations, as we always have, bilaterally. But the U.S. working with the EU, in my mind, as a military man, is a positive as opposed to anything else.
I mean, it's kind of it's not so much an either or issue. It's a both and, I would say. There are areas in which the US really does want to seek to empower the European Union. And I think the Center for American Progress report that was referenced in the question the other day was really a very good one, talking about sort of building up European Union defense capabilities. But there are going to be areas where, just because of the structure of the European Union, because of the consensus requirements of the European Union, you're not going to actually be able to make progress on certain issues. And in those areas, the US is going to have to continue to work with national capitals. And then obviously there are those countries, notably at this point the United Kingdom, that are outside the European Union, and so the US cannot use that framework to do it. So, I mean, I think, I understand the impetus for this question, but I think it really is a false dichotomy at this point. The US is just going to have to continue dealing with both sets of approaches to Europe and figure out what works best in what situations.
Thank you.
And just to underline that point, and I think it is definitely a case of both, and even in the areas that I particularly focus on of trade and regulatory policy, where the EU is state-like and has exclusive authority for dealing with those issues, you still have differences amongst the member states, and the US is always engaged with the member states in trying to shape EU policy and to understand EU positions. And then there are other issue areas. We have the military on the extreme end, which is entirely up to the member states. And so you have to deal with them. And a lot of foreign policy issues, it's you dealing with individual member states, or even when it's the EU is acting, it's member states are much more important. And then you have a whole bunch of areas where it's both the EU and the member states together, right? We sort of seen this in somewhat of a negative way in the case of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, but you can see it, with the corporate taxation is the EU could adopt rules on corporate taxation, but would have to do it unanimously, but the member states could each individually implement the OECD agreement themselves. Right? So you don't necessarily have the EU even acting at, the European Commission is probably trying to corral the member states, have common positions in the negotiations, but the member states have their own positions and are participating as themselves. So, there was a trend prior to the Trump administration where the transatlantic agenda was becoming more EU focused. There's an argument Mike Smith and Steve McGuire made that, through these transatlantic structures, the relationship was becoming, outside of the military was becoming funneled a bit more through Washington, Brussels channels, but the member states never faded away. And even in the areas where you have exclusive EU authority, the member states remain key policymakers. So it would be foolish for the US to neglect national capital.
Thank you. We're nearing the end of our conversation. We have worked our way through the audience's questions as far as I can tell. So I just want to give the panelists the opportunity for a minute or two of closing remarks. Any additional thoughts, anything else you would like to talk about? And just, we can go in the order.
I'll jump in first. Thank you, Dr. Weber. First of all, this was a really refreshing panel because what Georgia Tech and Sam Nunn School brought to the table are three very different series of expertise, and I learned a lot listening to my learned colleagues. I tell you that I see two things to close with. One, I've said it many times before, I'll say it many times into the future. NATO is now more important than it's ever been. And the Transatlantic Alliance and our relationship with our allies, in my opinion, is now more important than it's ever been. And so I believe this is an endeavor that we need to work at. And working at it certainly is about burden sharing, but understanding how burdens are shared may be bigger than just 2%. And so I hope that into the future we can bring a focus on the things that we do, the provisions that we make in basing and overflight rights and other things, as well as a continued emphasis on Article 3 should be center to everything we do with our allies. Thanks for allowing me to remark today.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ashford.
Yeah, great. No, and thanks to all the panelists and to the audience for their excellent questions. So I guess I just wanted to go back and reiterate one point that came up a couple of times earlier, and that's this question about wariness in European capitals. And I think, we are very much at a crossroads when it comes to the transatlantic relationship. There have been ups and downs in this relationship before. Nobody is denying that. Go back to the mid-2000s and look at, how France and Germany treated the, US invasion of Iraq and that whole thing. So these issues have happened before. But I think what we're seeing today is a much more fundamental rethinking of this relationship. And I think, this depends almost as much on, what the Biden administration does, how European states treat this relationship over the next 4 or 8 years, as it does, I think, simply on the course of US domestic politics over the next decade. There's been some really interesting polling released over the last couple of weeks in the run up to these summits. If you're interested, go and look. German Marshall Foundation did some really, German Marshall Fund did some really good ones. So did the European Council on Foreign Relations. And for me, the biggest takeaway that I was just really quite astounded to see was that both polls showed European publics just very skeptical about American domestic politics, and about whether America can continue to fulfill its traditional role in light of everything that's going on domestically in the country, and also that many European publics increasingly see Berlin as perhaps as important than Washington. And I think those sort of polling results suggest that we could come back in 4 or 8 years and be talking about, really quite a different transatlantic relationship. Now, that's not necessarily the case. It could be that things get smoothed over, that Biden's reelected another term, that things return somewhat to the status quo, or at least as much of the status quo as is possible. But I think it's also a very realistic possibility that we're looking at a very different transatlantic relationship in just a short period of time into the future. So I'll leave you with that thought.
Thanks very much. And Alasdair, last but not least.
All right. Well, I don't think I have it as eloquently, and I swear I had this down before Emma spoke. But I think that we're approaching a really, I mean, coming from a professor's perspective, a really fascinating time to be studying transatlantic relationships, because we are at this crossroads that Emma was discussing. And the way I was thinking of it is, you at the same time you have a renewed appreciation of the value of the relationship, which Phil was alluding to, but at the same time there's this understanding that there's no going back to the way things were, and we need to find something new. So at the same time, there's an appreciation of the relationship, but there's also a new sense we have to find out. We value it, but we're not quite sure what it is or how to make it work. And I think that makes this a really fascinating time to be a student of the transatlantic relationship.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our panelists. I've learned a lot. I'm now even more eager to go to Europe and follow these events by reading the European press and having discussions, conversations with family and friends. So thank you for sharing these very interesting thoughts. And I want to close by just thanking our sponsors again, the Bank of America. The program was also co-funded by the Erasmus program of the European Union, and of course the Georgia Tech Center for European Transatlantic Studies, as well as the Center for International Strategy, Technology, and Policy. So everyone be well. Thank you. And hopefully our path will cross again in the not too distant future.
Thank
Travel
you.
safely, Katja.
Yep. Safe travel.
Thanks. Bye. It was great to meet you, Emma.
Yes.
Yes, nice to meet you all.